In September 1997, a man walked into a PC World in Bristol and handed over a laptop for repair. He was not under investigation. No journalist was building a case against him. No former colleague had finally decided to speak. A technician opened the machine, found what was inside, and made a phone call. That phone call ended a career that the entire machinery of the British entertainment industry had spent 25 years choosing not to examine. This is the story of those 25 years, and of why it took a computer repair shop to do what everyone else had refused to. This was not a dramatic moment. There was no investigation that had led to it. No journalist had spent months building a case. No police unit had been monitoring him. No former colleague had finally decided to speak. A man needed his computer fixed, and he took it to a shop, and a technician opened it. And what the technician found ended, in one unremarkable afternoon, a career that the entire machinery of the British entertainment industry had spent 25 years choosing not to examine. The man was Paul Gadd. The world knew him as Gary Glitter. And the fact that it took a retail computer repair technician to do what the BBC, the music industry, the tabloid press, and the broader apparatus of British public life had collectively failed to do is not a footnote to this story. It is the story. Because Gary Glitter was not hidden. He was not operating in the shadows, unknown and unsuspected. He was a figure who had been discussed, rumored about, and in certain circles quietly known about for the better part of 2 decades before that laptop was opened. The warning signs were present. The access was documented. The behavior was, by any serious account, visible to people in positions of authority who chose, repeatedly and consistently, not to act on what they saw. This documentary is not primarily about what Gary Glitter did. The courts have established that record, and it is extensive. This is about the space between the warnings and the action, about the institutions that created that space, sustained it, and benefited from it, about the question that the 1997 arrest raises with a clarity that is difficult to argue with. If a shop worker could find what he found in an afternoon, what exactly had everyone else been doing for 25 years? Paul Francis Gadd was born in Banbury, Oxfordshire, in 1944. His early life was unremarkable by the standards of post-war provincial England. A working-class background, an absent father, a childhood that he would later describe in interviews as difficult and isolated. He discovered music in his teenage years and pursued it with the kind of single-minded ambition that characterizes people for whom performance offers something that ordinary life has withheld. He spent the 1960s in the lower reaches of the British pop industry, recording under a series of names that went nowhere, and accumulating a set of experiences in the music world that would later be relevant in ways that were not, at the time, apparent. He was not successful. He was not famous. He was a peripheral figure in an industry full of peripheral figures, and there was no particular reason by 1970 to believe that would change. What changed it was glam rock. The early 1970s produced a specific kind of British pop spectacle: platform boots, sequined costumes, theatrical excess, music designed less for critical appreciation than for maximum impact on a Saturday night audience. It suited Paul Gadd perfectly. As Gary Glitter, with the backing of producer Mike Leander, he had his first hit in 1972 with Rock and Roll Parts 1 and 2, a track so stripped back and visceral that it became, and has remained, one of the most recognizable pieces of music ever recorded in Britain. The irony of its subsequent cultural ubiquity, played at sporting events, in films, at arenas, is one of the more uncomfortable footnotes in British pop history. The hits continued through 1972, 1973, and 1974. I'm the leader of the gang. I love you, love me, love. Always yours. He was, for a period of approximately 3 years, one of the biggest pop stars in Britain. His audience was predominantly young, children and early teenagers who found the spectacle of his performances genuinely thrilling and who bought his records in quantities that placed him consistently at the top of the charts. That audience, its youth, its demographics, its composition, is not incidental to this account. It is the context within which everything that followed took place. And the access that came with it was not accidental. It was structural. It was built into the architecture of what Gary Glitter was and what the industry that created him understood him to be. Part 2. Access and its architecture. The British pop industry of the early 1970s operated with a degree of access between performers and young fans that would, by contemporary standards, be considered extraordinary. Fan culture in that era was different in kind from what it has since become. The barriers between a performer and an audience were minimal, physical, institutional, and procedural. Backstage access was informal. The concept of safeguarding as a formal institutional practice was essentially non-existent in entertainment contexts. Young fans, including children, came into direct contact with performers as a matter of routine, and the adults responsible for managing those interactions, managers, roadies, record company employees, and television producers, operated in a world where the risks this created were neither acknowledged nor discussed. The BBC was central to this world. Top of the Pops, which broadcast weekly and featured the biggest acts in British pop, was a program with a large young audience that was also, from a production standpoint, an environment in which performers had regular access to young people in informal, unsupervised settings. The culture of the program, and of the BBC more broadly in this period, has since been extensively documented in the context of the Jimmy Savile investigations. What those investigations established was not simply that Savile had abused his position, but that the institutional environment normalized a set of access patterns that made abuse structurally possible. Gary Glitter was part of that environment. He appeared on Top of the Pops repeatedly during his peak years. He worked within the same institutional framework. He was surrounded by the same culture of informal access, minimal oversight, and a collective willingness to treat the behavior of successful male performers as beyond scrutiny. His management during this period was handled by Mike Leander, the producer who had shaped his sound and his image, and by a network of industry figures whose primary interest was commercial. A Gary Glitter who sold records and filled venues was an asset. An asset requires protection. The protection extended, as it did in that industry at that time, to the management of information that might complicate the asset's commercial value. What was being managed specifically is something that former associates and journalists have discussed in the years since his convictions. The accounts converge on a pattern that was, by the mid-1970s, already visible to people working in his professional orbit. The behavior was not hidden. It was discussed, and it was not acted upon, because the industry in which it was occurring had no mechanisms, formal or informal, that would have produced action. The incentives all pointed the other way. Part 3. The decline and what it obscured. Gary Glitter's commercial peak lasted approximately 3 years. By 1975, the glam rock era was contracting, his chart positions were declining, and the cultural moment that had made him relevant was passing. The second half of the 1970s brought financial difficulties, a bankruptcy in 1980, and the slow, grinding experience of a career that had once been at the center of British popular culture and was now somewhere near its edges. This period matters to this account for a specific reason. The declining years of a pop career are, in institutional terms, the period of least scrutiny. The press loses interest. Management attention shifts to more commercially productive clients. The BBC books him less frequently. The apparatus of the industry, which had organized itself around him during the profitable years, gradually withdraws. And in the space that withdrawal creates, behavior that might have attracted attention during the peak years continues unobserved because the institutional eye is no longer watching. He continued to perform. The nostalgia circuit that British pop generates is extensive, and a figure with a run of genuine hits from the early 1970s could find consistent work on it for decades. He toured. He appeared at festivals and revival events. He gave interviews in which he presented himself as a survivor, someone who had ridden the peaks and troughs of the industry and come out the other side with his resilience intact. The interviews were not probing. The journalists who conducted them were not, for the most part, asking questions that would have required truthful answers about anything other than the music. There is something worth examining in the specific texture of those interviews. The British entertainment press in the 1980s and the 1990s was not an institution with a strong tradition of investigative scrutiny of its subjects. It was, for the most part, a transactional environment. Performers provided access and quotes. Publications provided coverage and promotion. The relationship was mutually dependent, and that dependence produced a systematic softness, not corruption in the formal sense, but a structural reluctance to ask the questions that might have ended the relationship. A journalist who pressed Gary Glitter on the rumors circulating in the industry about his behavior was a journalist who had burned their access, not just to him, but potentially to the management network that connected him to dozens of other clients. The incentive to stay soft was not subtle. Meanwhile, the accounts that have since emerged from people who worked around him or who encountered him during this period describe a pattern of behavior that was consistent, visible to those in proximity to it, and unreported. The reasons for the non-reporting are familiar from other cases of this type. The people involved were in professional environments where speaking out carried costs and produced no visible benefit. The culture of the industry did not reward disclosure, and the subject of the potential disclosure was, even in his reduced commercial circumstances, still a figure with sufficient standing and resources to make retaliation a credible concern. There is also the question of what speaking out would have meant, practically, in the absence of a mechanism to receive it. Informal disclosure, telling a colleague or expressing concern within a working environment, is not the same as formal reporting. And formal reporting, in the entertainment industry of the 1980s, had no obvious destination. There was no institutional channel designed to receive and act on concerns about a performer's behavior toward young people. The structures that might have created accountability simply did not exist. And in their absence, the informal knowledge that accumulated about Paul Gadd had nowhere to go. This is the long middle section of the Gary Glitter story, the years between the fame and the arrest that existing documentaries tend to move through quickly, because the facts are less dramatic than what preceded and followed them. But it is, in many ways, the most important section. It is the period in which the failure that allowed him to operate was most clearly visible. Not the failure of a single institution, but the cumulative failure of a set of institutions, the entertainment industry, the press, and the broader culture to treat the information available to them as something requiring action. Part 4. The laptop. In September 1997, Paul Gadd took a laptop computer to PC World in Bristol. He had purchased the machine and was experiencing technical difficulties with it. He wanted it repaired. The technician who worked on the laptop, in the course of examining its contents for diagnostic purposes, discovered a folder containing what were subsequently identified as indecent images of children. The technician reported what he had found to the police. The police investigated. In November 1997, Paul Gadd was arrested. The simplicity of that sequence is worth sitting with. The entire mechanism that finally produced an investigation consisted of one person doing their job conscientiously and one person making a phone call. There was no prior intelligence. There was no investigation that had been building toward this moment. There was no journalist who had finally managed to get the story past their editor, no former colleague who had decided that silence was no longer possible, no institutional process that had been, however slowly, grinding toward accountability. The arrest was, in every meaningful sense, an accident. It was a function of the specific and unrepeatable circumstance of a laptop being taken to a specific shop on a specific day and being examined by a specific technician who happened to look at the right folder. He pleaded guilty in 1999 to the possession of child abuse images. He was sentenced to 4 months in prison, later reduced on appeal to a 2-month community service order. He was placed on the sex offenders register. The response to the conviction from the British entertainment industry was swift in the most superficial sense and slow in every meaningful one. His music was pulled from radio playlists. His public appearances became impossible. The industry distanced itself efficiently and without apparent self-examination. There were no public statements from former colleagues acknowledging what had been known. There were no institutional reviews of the access patterns that had characterized his career. There was no reckoning with the question that the accident of the laptop demanded. If this was what a repair technician found in an afternoon, what had the industry been choosing not to find for the previous 25 years? The answer to that question was not pursued. The conviction was processed as an individual failure, the failure of Paul Gadd, rather than as a systemic one. And in the absence of that reckoning, the conditions that had produced it remained intact. Part 5. After the conviction. What happened after 1999 is, in some respects, the most instructive part of the Gary Glitter story. He left the country, found new environments in which his access to children was even less restricted than it had been in Britain, and he continued offending for another 15 years before a second reckoning finally caught up with him. He moved first to Cambodia, then to Vietnam. His presence in Southeast Asia and his activities there were documented by journalists and reported by British newspapers. He was photographed. His whereabouts were known. The question of what he was doing in countries where child protection frameworks were significantly weaker than in Britain was asked in print on multiple occasions. He was expelled from Cambodia. He was arrested in Vietnam in 2005 and convicted in 2006 of committing obscene acts with 2 girls aged 10 and 11. He was sentenced to 3 years in a Vietnamese prison, served approximately half of it, and was deported back to Britain in 2008. He was on the sex offenders register. The Vietnamese conviction was a matter of public record. His return to Britain was covered by the press. And yet, the formal investigation that would eventually produce his second British conviction did not begin until 2012, when Operation U-Tree, The Metropolitan Police investigation, initiated in the wake of the Savile revelations, created an institutional environment in which historical allegations against public figures could be pursued with sufficient resources and political will. The gap between 2008 and 2012 is not, in itself, a scandal of the same order as the preceding decades. The formal mechanisms of investigation take time to build, and the U-Tree investigation was responding to an enormous volume of cases simultaneously. But the gap is worth noting because it is consistent with the broader pattern this case illustrates. The default of British institutions, when confronted with information about the behavior of a public figure, has been to wait for a mechanism that makes action unavoidable rather than to create one. In 2012, Paul Gadd was arrested as part of Operation U-Tree. The investigation that followed examined allegations spanning decades. Allegations from women who had been children when they encountered him, who had attempted to report their experiences and been disbelieved or ignored, who had carried what had happened to them through their adult lives in the knowledge that the man responsible had continued his career without consequence. The trial took place in 2015. He was convicted of 4 counts of indecent assault against girls aged between 8 and 13, committed from 1975 to 1980. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison. The victim testimony during the trial was consistent in ways that are by now familiar from other cases of this type. Girls who had been fans, who had come into contact with him through the fan culture that surrounded his career, who had been in environments, backstage areas, meet and greet situations, informal post-show gatherings, where his access to them was facilitated by the machinery of the entertainment industry and by the adults responsible for managing it. Several of the women who gave evidence described having attempted, in the years after the abuse, to report what had happened. The accounts of those attempts are consistent with the broader picture of institutional failure this case documents. They were not believed. They were told, implicitly or explicitly, that their word against that of a public figure was not something that would produce results. They were navigating the same structural asymmetry that had protected him throughout his career, the asymmetry between a man with institutional standing, resources, and the cultural credibility of fame, and young people without any of those things. The 16-year sentence was the formal conclusion of a legal process that had taken, from the first offenses to the final conviction, approximately 40 years. During those 40 years, the behavior that produced the conviction had been visible, in various forms and to various degrees, to a significant number of people in positions of authority. The question of why none of those people acted is not answered by the trial. The trial established what he did. It did not examine the structure that allowed him to do it. Part 7. The industry and its choices. The British music industry of the 1970s was not a uniquely corrupt or uniquely negligent institution. It was an institution with recognizable structural characteristics that produced predictable outcomes. It was an industry built around the commercial exploitation of talent, in which the primary incentive at every level was financial. A performer who generated revenue was an asset. An asset required protection from commercial competitors, from press intrusion that might damage marketability, from anything that might interrupt the flow of revenue the asset produced. The protection was not conspiratorial, it was instinctive, structural, and consistent with the logic of every commercial enterprise that has ever calculated that the cost of examining a profitable relationship too closely outweighs the benefit. The BBC operated as an adjacent institution with its own internal logic, its own hierarchy, and its own reasons for not asking questions about the behavior of performers who brought audiences to its programs. The Savile investigations established the contours of that logic in detail. What they also established is that the culture in which Gary Glitter's behavior went unreported was not an anomaly confined to Savile's specific relationships. It was a feature of the institutional environment itself. The tabloid press, which might in theory have been expected to pursue the story, operated under constraints of its own. Libel law in Britain made the publication of unverified allegations against public figures extremely expensive. The commercial incentives of celebrity journalism ran directly counter to the investigation of the celebrities it depended on for material. Editors who might have commissioned investigations were also editors who relied on access to the entertainment world for the content their papers needed. The same asymmetry that protected Glitter within the industry protected him from the press that covered it. What this picture describes is not a conspiracy. It is something more mundane and more difficult to address than a conspiracy. It is a set of overlapping institutional interests, each individually rational, that collectively produced an environment in which a man could offend for decades without consequence. Each institution could, at any given moment, point to the actions of another as the reason it had not acted. The press could say it had no verified evidence. The industry could say it was not the police. The police could say they had received no formal complaints. The circle of non-responsibility was complete, and it closed around its subject with a reliability that functioned, in practical terms, as protection. Part 8. The question the laptop asks. Return, for a moment, to the PC world in Bristol in 1997. The technician who found those images did not work within any of the institutions described above. He was not subject to their incentive structures, their cultural pressures, their calculations about the cost of acting on information. He was a person doing a job, who found something that he understood to be wrong, and who reported it to the appropriate authority. The entire accountability mechanism that finally produced an investigation was generated by the removal of institutional context, by the accident of a private machine being examined outside the environment that had protected its owner. That is the cleanest possible illustration of what institutional protection actually is. It is not active conspiracy. It is the removal of the conditions under which ordinary human responses, "I have found something wrong, I should report it," can operate freely. Within the institutions that surrounded Gary Glitter's career, those conditions did not exist. The technician in Bristol was outside those institutions, and so he did what they had failed to do. The 16-year sentence handed down in 2015 was justice in the narrowest sense. It addressed what had been done. It did not address the structure that had enabled it, the institutions that had sustained that structure, or the question of what those institutions owed to the people they had failed. That question remains open. It is not unique to the Gary Glitter case. It is the question raised by every case in this category, by Savile, by Harris, and by the long list of figures whose behavior was visible before it was actionable, whose access was facilitated by institutions that later presented themselves as victims of his deception. The institutions were not primarily victims. They were primarily participants, not in the abuse itself, but in the conditions that made it possible. The distinction matters because it locates the failure correctly, not in the individual pathology of one man, which can be processed as an aberration, contained and set aside, but in the structural logic of institutions that decided repeatedly and consistently that the cost of looking was higher than the cost of not looking. Epilogue. What remains? Paul Gadd is in prison. He will be in his late 80s when he is released, if he survives his sentence. His music has been largely withdrawn from official use, though the complete erasure of a catalogue that includes some of the most recognizable recordings in British pop history is an exercise that time and the internet have made essentially impossible. The women who testified against him in 2015 carried their experiences for 40 years before a trial gave their accounts institutional weight. What they lost in those 40 years, the particular cost of being disbelieved, of watching a man continue to be celebrated by the culture that had failed to protect them, is not something a conviction returns. Their accounts during the trial were detailed and consistent. They described not just what had been done to them, but the specific texture of the environment in which it happened, the backstage corridors, the informal gatherings, the adults who were present and said nothing, the sense of being in a space where normal rules did not apply because the person at its center was someone who existed in the cultural imagination of the time, outside the category of people who did harm. That experience, the experience of being in proximity to fame and finding that proximity had suspended your ability to name what was happening to you, is one of the most consistent features of every testimony in every case of this type. It is not unique to Gary Glitter's victims. It is the predictable product of a culture that treated fame as a character reference, and that organized its institutions around the protection of the famous at the expense of those who encountered them. The institutions that surrounded his career have not, in any formal sense, accounted for their role. The BBC has issued statements. The music industry has distanced itself. The mechanisms of collective non-responsibility that characterized the original failure have been applied with equal efficiency to the question of reckoning with it. Each institution has processed the case as the failure of an individual, placed the individual's failure outside its own institutional boundaries, and moved forward. That processing is itself a form of institutional choice. It is the choice to treat Gary Glitter as an aberration rather than a product, as something that happened to the institutions around him rather than something that happened in part because of them. The PC World technician in Bristol made a different choice. He had no institutional interest to protect, no calculation to perform about the cost of acting, no cultural framework telling him that the person whose laptop he was examining was beyond scrutiny. He simply looked at what was in front of him and did what the situation required. The institutions that had surrounded Paul Gadd for 25 years had been in front of the same information in various forms for most of those years. They had made a different calculation, and the distance between those two responses, the technicians and the industries, is the precise measure of what institutional protection costs and who pays for it. The title of this documentary asks why no one stopped Gary Glitter. The answer, assembled from 4 decades of institutional behavior, is not complicated. No one stopped him because the systems designed to stop people like him were also the systems that had built him, employed him, and profited from him. And systems, as a general rule, do not stop what they have made. They wait for someone outside their logic to do it for them. In this case, that person worked in a computer repair shop in Bristol. He was not famous. He had no industry relationships to protect. He was not calculating the cost of what he had found against the benefit of reporting it. He found something wrong, and he reported it. That is all it took. And the fact that it took 25 years for those specific conditions to align, for the right person to open the right laptop on the right afternoon, tells you everything about the value of the institutions that were supposed to make such accidents unnecessary.